sessions we've had so far, but every bit as important. And I'm delighted that LEV Foundation's Executive Director, David Wood, has agreed to moderate and chair this session, so I'll turn it over to him. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Aubrey. So here is our trigger warning. I'm going to say a 4-letter word. Are you ready? Politics. Politics, politics. You know, as Mark Twain once says, there are 3 kinds of lies. There are lies, damned lies, and politicians. Anyway, what we're going to talk about here is to what extent should we, in the longevity community, be prioritizing talking to politicians? After all, politicians have got the power over regulations, the power over incentives, the power over large budgets. Or should instead we be talking to the public? And if we talk in the right way to the public, eventually the public will talk to politicians and they'll steer things positively. Is that the priority? We're going to hear from a number of panelists, and the first up is a professor in economics from London Business School, Professor AndrewScott. Where are you, Andrew? Here you are. Welcome, Andrew.
Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you're doing well. I'll be good when I get my clicker. There we go. Yeah, definitely a change. So I was asked about political influence, and I'm going to use that as an opportunity to really talk about my work, as everyone does when I do a presentation. And of course, there's loads of ways that you can influence things, but I don't think it's an either-or. It's about hitting every particular branch. But let me tell you a little bit about my background and why I'm here, and why I think, explaining my work and how I'm trying to influence policy may fit in. So I'm a macroeconomist. For most of my career, I've focused on monetary and fiscal policy. And that's, as an academic in that area, it's pretty easy to mix and mingle with policymakers, central banks, ministries of finance. And it's a pretty easy world where ideas have impact, for better or for worse, you might want to consider. But it's a really easy flow backwards and forward. Both academics, particularly theoretical academics, setting the agenda for policymakers, and policymakers coming to academics and saying, here's our problems, what do we do about it? So I think it's kind of an interesting model. But then for various reasons, after the last financial crisis, I just got very bored with it all. And there were sort of 2 reasons. One was intellectual. There was a great deal of intellectual conservatism amongst policymakers. The big crisis has happened, but we're going to carry on doing what we've always done before. The second challenge is I just got bored. There's only so long you can talk about whether interest rates are going to go up or go down next month. And so I wrote with my colleague at London Business School a book called The 100-Year Life, really riffing off a lecture I would give to my students about an aging society. And it was about how behaviorally we have to respond to the fact we're living longer. And it was really focusing on careers and how we need to work for longer, and how do we manage that, and how do you change what you do because of it. And to my pleasant surprise, the book's become a great success. We just got confirmation we sold 1 million copies now globally. So that positive agenda, thinking about how people change their behavior and addressing to their own individual problems, seemed to pay very dividends. But I think the real success of the book was it says, hey, there's this aging society story, but there's something else happening. There's not just more old people. This is about you and how you need to change how you age. And I sort of, since the last 5 or 6 years, that's been the focus of my academic research. And I've been getting out and about, meeting all sorts of wonderful, interesting people, such as yourself. Who knew there were people who were more interesting than central bankers? I never thought that could be possible. And then, after a few years mixing in different communities, I thought, right, how do we go back and get these ideas to have impact? And I realized I've got to spend a lot more time with economists and central bankers again. Partly because it's my strength, but also because it's a great way of trying to actually make things happen. So that's a little bit of background, and then I'm going to try and feed that into what I'm going to talk about. So, of course, how do we get change? We have to change the narrative. And that's both obvious and bland, but also quite profound. Because changing narratives are very, very hard, and it's going to be drop by drop by drop until the stone dissolves and melts, and eventually you start to have changed the narrative. But what's the narrative that I, in particular, am keen to change? Well, it's this aging society story. I have to say, demographers, I think, have done us a great disservice in the way they get policymakers to think about the big challenges going forward. And they focus on an aging society. And since an undergraduate days, which is more than 35 years ago now, this is the story that everyone always thinks about. There's just more old people. There's fewer younger people, and being old's a problem. They don't work, they get ill, they're just a pain, and the whole of society is going to have a problem. And look at this picture here. You draw a line across, say at 60, some arbitrary age, and say, wow, there's a lot more old people, both numbers and proportion. The world is going to hell in a handcart. And that is the narrative that has to be changed. It is a seismic change to see this big shift in the population structure. We'd never seen it before. But I'm not sure how interesting that is. I'm not saying it's not important, I'm not sure how interesting it is. And whenever I see consultants give talk about aging society, they will start with this rising number of people aged over 65. And I can kind of set my timer to know that in a few minutes, I'm going to be told that in Japan they sell more adult diapers than baby diapers. And I kind of never know what to make of that statistic, because it doesn't seem that profound a change in terms of humanity. In terms of business, I don't know. I've never made a diaper in my life, but I can't imagine it's that much complicated to make adult diapers than baby diapers. It's just not a very profound thing. So instead, I think we need to look at this chart differently. Instead of drawing a horizontal line, just draw a vertical line. And say, implicitly, the real thing that's changed is the young will become old. And that's that longevity society narrative that I think is so important. We've got to shift away from an aging society, there are lots of old people, to more, for the first time ever in human history, the young and middle-aged can expect to become very old. And that's not based around any of the sort of breakthroughs that you're talking about in this conference. That's just about what is already the reality. So this is UK government data, Office for National Statistics. It's probably going to be downgraded a little bit, but this is projections, cohort life expectancy projections based on life expectancy trends. You can see at the end there's sort of two numbers, a lower and an upper bound. These are purely statistical extrapolations. The upper bound says let's just extrapolate linearly past trends. The lower bound says let's assume it starts to slow down. Being in a group of people focused on biology, you're going to have no time for this because this is basically statistical projections, but it's the projections that governments use. And it shows clearly what the real change is. The first time ever, the young now have a more than 50% chance of making it to 95. And that's without, as I say, factoring in the remarkable progress that's been discussed in this conference. And that, to me, is what we have to focus on. It's about the young and middle-aged becoming older. And, of course, we fear these older outcomes. I'll talk later about Jonathan Swift and Gulliver Travels. The Strouberg outcome is that we're going to live longer, but we're just not aging better. And Swift does a great job at just sort of making it sound the most awful thing in the world. What's basically happened is we've achieved a first longevity revolution. Global life expectancy is now over 70. The majority of people in high-income countries can expect to become old. And in fact, even if you look at low-income countries, that's the work I'm doing at the moment, newborns in low-income countries, their biggest health burden, expected health burden, is actually aging-related disease. That's how profound the life expectancy changes have occurred. So a first longevity revolution has happened. The majority of the young in high-income countries can expect to become old, which then says the biggest health challenge, the biggest social challenge we've got is to age well. And that's never been something we've had to focus on before. Of course there's been old people before, but we've never had the young having such high probability of getting old. And that's a very profound change for people to understand. So that, of course, means we need to have a second longevity revolution. We need to change how we age. And the problem with the aging society story is it just says there's a change in the age structure of the population. It assumes that how we age is fixed and we can't do anything about it. But the longevity society says, actually, because the young can now expect to become the very old, we have to change how we age. We have an economic incentive to change how we age. If getting to 90 was a 10% probability when you're 20, you don't spend your time investing in your future. When it becomes more than 50% chance, you then need to start investing in it. And that's that fundamental change. How do we change how we age? And that's a hard thing for people to grasp. I'll skip some slides. I call it the evergreen syllogism because what I'm trying to do with this word evergreen, I'm training my new book which comes out next March. But we hear about the silver economy. We need to hear a lot more about the evergreen economy, changing how we age. And it's a very simple syllogism I try and use with people and with governments. I've just sort of said you can expect now to become very old, even without making wild assumptions about technological progress. 2, we fear getting old. Put those two things together and you get the conclusion, what do you do now to age well? And this is, to me, this issue of how we shift from an aging society. It's not just about there being more old people. We've really, really got to move away from that because that just doesn't seem to shift the political agenda other than trying to meet the immediate needs of older people. But of course, once you start with this longevity approach, you can see that there's 2 more important concepts of age that come to the fore. One is the number of years you've got to live, and the other is your biological age. And both of those are missing from chronological age. Chronological age is not malleable, chronological age is backward, not forward-looking. But if we're trying to get political influence, we've got to think more about this forward-looking approach and that malleability. And that's the difference between an aging society story versus a longevity society. Of course, the great advantage of the longevity society is it's going to be much more positive. It's about how we adapt to longer lives. You move away from that negativity of an aging society story. But at its core is that whatever your age, you have more time. And secondly, you can change how you age. This, of course, is much broader than just the science. It's also about what you do with your time is another way in which we can change how we age. So let me now move on a little bit more at sort of a general setting to what I'm trying to do in terms of policy. And that's about saying, okay, we've already got longer lives, and we may be getting even longer ones in the future, but we've got to achieve a 3-dimensional longevity dividend. The first thing everyone says is, I want my years to be healthy. Absolutely. I'll look at sort of the value of that in a moment. The third thing we have to do is we've got to get the resources to finance this longer life. So how do we make life more productive? Now, this is where, as an economist, I'm going to start talking about dollars, because the real power of economics is not necessarily our intellectual strengths, although I think there's some aspects of that. It's that we're just very good at putting a dollar on everything. And dollars is the common language of government. So there's 3 ways you can think about converting this longevity agenda into dollars. The first, which is the response I get most of the time from the health world, not necessarily the economic world, is what does it mean for GDP? If people are healthier for longer, what boost to GDP does it give? The second, which is also, I think, quite common, is how can you help me reduce my spending costs? And the third, which is the one I've sort of started with because it's the easiest to do, is just how valuable is it to us, which is a completely different thing from those first 2. How I value the health of my children is not dependent on their future income potential. It's just something that's valuable. So 3 different tools. And what I'm going to try and sort of say here, I think there's a way to really sort of get into policymakers' hearts is to use the language and the models they've got. And once you do that, it's pretty obvious how important it is. Now, of course, that's a little bit surprising because what we're talking about here is quite a radical change in how we think about life, in changing how we age. But I think to make sure we influence policymakers is thinking, what are the problems you've got? What tools do you use to analyze it? How can we use that to make the case? Now, on these 3 ways of committing dollars, let me just sort of start with the first one, the GDP one. It's the one I'm most interested in. It's the one I'm doing lots of work on. It's really complicated. I'll give you, at the bottom I've got a sort of a 5-minute calculation that gives you a good answer. But, the economy is a complicated system, just as the body and how it ages is a complicated system. And if we really are healthier for much longer, if we live a lot longer, lots of things change, like education across your lifetime. How do you maintain innovation and change? So there's loads of different assumptions. It's a bit like how technology affects the economy. Technology depends on the technology. It depends whether it supports labor or supports capital. So there's a lot of work to be done before you can come up with a realistic answer. If we live longer in better health, this is the GDP gains. But you can do some back-of-the-envelope calculations. So here's just one. If you could get Americans aged 65 to 69 to have the same participation rate, the same employment levels as 60 to 64-year-olds, that's another 4 million workers. That's another 3% of GDP every year. And 3% of GDP, that's a big number. US GDP is several $1 trillion, so we're talking about a lot of money. The second argument, and I want to try and encourage you not to get involved in this one, is the notion that if we age better, we'd save money because we wouldn't be spending it on dementia and care homes. I really think it's important to move away from that because I suspect some of the treatments that we'll come out with may well be expensive. Some may be cheap, some may be expensive. But if, we could come up with a cure for dementia, that it costs twice as much as we currently spend on dementia, I'm all in. I mean, that's a great way of spending money. Health is a luxury commodity in economics. As we get richer, we spend more of our money on health. And of course, as we live longer, aging becomes more important. And health to a GDP ratio does rise over time. A couple of Stanford economists, Bob Hall and Chuck Jones, nice paper. This is a theoretical simulation, but just shows you that bottom line is health expenditure in the US relative to GDP. Then they have a simple model which says there's health, and there's income, and there's consumption. As we get richer, where do we put our money? And it becomes clear we value health a lot. And health should rise remarkably. And they predict that the health share of GDP will probably rise to about 30% of GDP. Lots of assumptions, lots of counterfactuals, but that's why we warn against saying you're going to save money in this. This is about how we value the outcomes. So how do we value the gains? This is the work I've done with Martin Ellison, David Sinclair, and more recently with a postdoc, Julian Ashwin. We look at lots of different scenarios of how you can age better. We give them nice little fictional names, Strudberg, Dorian Gray, Peter Pan, and Wolverine. But the essence of this paper is basically using economic tools to value gains to health and value gains to longevity. Give me a problem and we'll put a dollar value on it. And so, economics is all about trade-offs. We like extra life because it's more time. We like time. But of course, we like healthy years even better than just time. But if I'm living for longer, I'm going to have to work for longer, and that's a problem because I like leisure. So we can set up economic models and say, okay, let's change how long you live for, let's change your health profile, let's see what you do in terms of optimizing your work patterns, how long you work for, how much you spend each year, how much leisure you have, and we can put a monetary value on it. Now, the results are perhaps blindingly obvious, but let me try and quickly go through them. The first is Strudberg outcomes, living for longer, are actually valuable. We like time. But of course, they're diminishing in value because health diminishes as well. The second thing is that increasing life expectancy really isn't the most valuable thing right now. The most important thing is compressing lifespan. In fact, based on US data, if you could get a full compression of morbidity, it's more valuable than another year of life expectancy. So that's sort of one or the other type of thing. But there's an obvious complementarity here. Basically, the further life expectancy gets above healthy life expectancy, the less you value longevity gains. But the more health span catches up with lifespan, the more you value lifespan. So, there's a sort of a natural sort of flow to this challenge, which of course is why slowing down aging becomes so important. Because if you slow down aging, you get both of those channels. And you deal with the diminishing returns from just working on one dimension rather than the other. So we learn two things. Of course, the irony about longer life is I always run out of time. So here we go. I've got 1.5 minutes left. First of all, this is just putting a value on if you could slow down biological age in the sense of lowering mortality rates and lowering morbidity rates. So you slow down the relationship each with chronological age. And this says, what's the value to different economies for achieving a 1-year improvement in life expectancy by slowing down how we age biologically? The answers are on the right-hand side. They're all in trillions of dollars. So for the US, it's 51 trillion. It's a big number. And here you've got the two penultimate columns are showing you. The first is what it means for everyone who's currently alive. So that's where you get the 38 trillion for the United States. But then, of course, you also think about the future generations to come who will benefit. And that gives you another 12.5. It's all discounted, etc. The numbers vary on the right-hand side because countries have got different GDP, they've got different population size, but basically it's worth about 3 to 4% of GDP each year. And if you think about COVID and kind of the shuttering of the economy and the falls of GDP that happened, that seems about right. We showed during COVID how much we value health and aging because we let the economy fall to save lives. And this is what this calculation is sort of showing you. There's nothing more valuable than our health. And right now, the biggest health challenge is how we age. And that 3 to 4% number is not the boost to GDP you get, it's simply just how valuable it is. Let me, in the minus 10 seconds left I've got, just say what I'm trying to do more in terms of governments themselves. And there's a big agenda, and hitting the public, I think, is absolutely key, because politicians listen to the public. But going back to sort of trying to solve the problems that people face and using the tools they've got, here is how I'm going to go back and try to get ministries of finance and central banks to listen. The first is, if you look at this chart here, employment starts to fall from 50 onwards. People start to leave the labour market from age 50. There's a lot of debate about changing the retirement age, but to be honest, if you're not working at 65, you're not going to be working at 66. So I think that's all a waste of time. What we need to try and do is get people working from 50 up until the state pension age. And people are not retiring by choice. They're retiring because of caring burdens, because they're ill, because of skills, because of ageism. So getting ministries of finance to say, look, here's something, it's a free lunch. If I can get people working from 50 to 65, I get a big increase in GDP, and I don't have all the political problems about raising the state pension age. And this is then when you start focusing on the health of people age 50 plus. Most ministers of finance in low-income countries think health is good for GDP. They tend not to think about it that way in high-income countries. The second is getting governments to set healthy life expectancy as a government target, to elevate it along with GDP. Actually, with an aging society, this makes a lot of sense, because with a lot of older people, not many are working, GDP will decline. It's going to be the health that really matters. But if we can get governments to target healthy life expectancy, we've seen how valuable it is. That needs to be a cornerstone of how governments evaluate so many of their policies. If, for instance, you made the state pension age dependent on a healthy life expectancy, which economic theory basically says you should, not on life expectancy, but on healthy life expectancy, Ministry of Finance then have got an incentive to spend money and say to the Ministry of Health, not just here's a bunch of money, spend it as you see fit. Say, here's a bunch of money, I want you to boost healthy life expectancy, because it will boost employment and it will bring money in. So these are just three really simple ways, but if you can reframe the debate as being about healthy life expectancy, then it's pretty obvious people will come knocking your door and say, you've got a way to try and boost it? And let me just close with one last comment, which for me I think is the key to, or to me the most interesting result with a paper with David Sinclair and Martin Ellison, which is less to do with the big number. Yeah, it's nice to come up with a big number, but take the biggest health challenge, add it over billions of people, you get a big, important welfare number. But what's, I think, really interesting is this virtuous circle that exists for aging, which doesn't exist for any other health disease. I said earlier, as life expectancy increases relative to healthspan, you value healthspan more, and as healthspan catches up with lifespan, you value longevity more. Well, that's the virtuous circle that means that actually focusing on slowing down how we age becomes the most important health challenge. But what's interesting, if you look at things like infant mortality, when you tackle infant mortality, once you've sort of improved it, you're no longer interested in it. It's just not a very important health challenge. You now move on to the diseases of early adulthood. And once you reduce the mortality rate from early adulthood, you're no longer interested in it, because now the biggest risk is late adult. But with aging, the better we get at aging, the more valuable further gains are. When you're ill in your 90s, people don't want to live to their 90 or 100. But if they're well in their 90s and 100s, then bring on 110, 120. So this focus on healthy aging unlocks what I think is that virtuous circle. And I just close by saying, we are now, I think, at a radically different moment in human history, because for the first time ever in human history, the majority of the young can expect to become the very old. And that changes everything. It then means that healthy aging becomes the biggest challenge where we have to put resources, and the better we get at doing it, the more the future demand is. So I will stop there, but thank you.